Hello, and welcome to We Will Manage, the podcast exploring the weird and wonderful world of work. We're two young professionals figuring out our careers one conversation at a time. And today we have a very special guest.
So stick around to meet Ronald Harden, the man who single-handedly changed the way doctors are born and who also responds to the name of Granddaddy. I don't think I told you, but we always have cups of tea when we record. So it's very fitting that you wanted one. So you've got one as well.
Right, good.
You're a natural.
Let's jump in. This is our last episode of the entire season, of our first ever season. So we're very excited and honored to have you on.
I was reading up a little bit on your background, which I had no idea of. So I'm very excited to chat about it. To me, you're just Alba's granddaddy, but you're so much more than just Alba's granddaddy, aren't you?
He certainly is. So for those of you who don't know who Ronald Harden is, we've prepared a little introduction for him. Professor Ronald Harden is an internationally renowned leader in medical education with a career spanning of over 60 years. Originally, he trained as a endocrinologist after graduating from medical school in Glasgow, and then he later dedicated his life's work to transforming how medical professionals are trained worldwide. So that's really what we're going to be diving into a bit in today's episode and asking you a lot about that. Some of your amazing contributions have been that you developed the Objective Structured Clinical Examination, also known as OSCE, now a global standard for assessing clinical competence in healthcare. You also introduced innovative models for curriculum planning, such as the SPICES model and outcome-based education, which I actually know a little bit about because I sometimes prepare the presentations for you. And you also established the Centre for Medical Education at the University of Dundee in 1972, which was the first of its kind. And lastly, some global impact and recognition that you've had throughout your career has been that you've published more than 400 influential papers and several best-selling books for educators and students, honored with countless awards, including the Karolinska Institute Prize for Research in Medical Education, which is often equated to the Nobel Prize of the field. And you've been given an OBE from the Queen, as well as honorary degrees around the world. And of course, you continue to inspire and challenge medical education globally. And that is why we have got you on today, because you are such an inspiration. And mainly you focus on advocating for students as active partners in their own learning. Have we missed anything?
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. And when we come and maybe talk a little later also about the OSCE, but thank you. And it's great to join you for this session. And if it's the last session of your series, I hope it's a success and not a disappointment. We got out with a real bang in this final session. So great to join you and chat with you.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Right. So we've got a few questions that we are curious to know about. I don't know if Saoirse, if maybe you'd like to jump in with a couple first.
Sure. I mean, as I said, I know you more as a person than as a professional. So I know a little bit about your background, but maybe if you could just talk to us a little bit about what first drew you into the career of medicine. Was it something that you were interested in from a very early age? How did that happen?
Well, I was always thought about being a doctor from, I think, quite an early age, as my brother as well, who's just 2 years younger. And we became interested, and it seemed just a great idea to do it. It wasn't a question of saving lives or anything like that. I remember the dean at the interviews in Glasgow, if people said you're joining medicine to become better at saving lives, he always told them you'd be better than going and joining the fire service and joining medicine. But that wasn't my overall ambition. But it seemed like a good thing to do. And I became trained at Glasgow, became more and more interested in teaching, and the professor of medicine at that time said, look, I was doing research in iodine metabolism and thyroid disease. He said, look, lots of people are working on that, but very few people at that time were interested in looking at medical education. It was seen as not people were just born teachers. You didn't need to do anything about training them to be better teachers. And why don't you put more of your efforts into the teaching and to research into education? Then when an opportunity came up later to move to Dundee to run a new Department of Medical Education. That seemed a great idea as well, and we moved through to Dundee, and while continuing some of my work in thyroid disease and endocrinology, gradually I spent more and more time on teaching, and it's been really very fulfilling and worthwhile.
So it was quite early on then that you started with teaching and education.
Yes, indeed. One of the first developments I had was this new objective structured clinical examination. I was, part of my responsibilities in Glasgow as a teacher, a lecturer, was to help run the final examination. And in the final examination, see who would graduate from medical school with a MBCHB degree. The clinical examination was a key bit of that examination. And there was increasing, this was way back in the 1970s, there was a lot of criticism that it really was not a very reliable or a very testing what you wanted to test. And looking at the students involved in the exam, I was always worried each year that some students who I felt really shouldn't pass, and I really wouldn't want them to treat me or my relatives passed, and others who I thought were really very good failed. So I thought it wasn't a very good exam, and I did a study at that time to show how unreliable it was, and got recorded about 14 students sitting a mock exam, and then got a range of examiners to mark this on a videotape, and it was huge variation in the marks. And the same worry was going on in the States. I mean, in the UK, John Stokes, who was a senior physician in London, called the clinical exam the half-hour disaster session and the sacred cow of British medicine. And the same problem in the States. And they did some or similar studies, but decided it was so unreliable, inaccurate, the clinical exam, that they would switch entirely to multiple-choice written exams. And this seemed to me as not really correct, that no matter how good an MCQ was, you couldn't tell by how somebody's ability to answer multiple choice questions whether they'd be a good doctor or not. And one needed to improve the clinical exam. And that was a stimulus to work on a new method of setting up a new type of clinical exam that was, as it said, more objective. It was more structured and more reliable. And you examined students actually over a series of stations, maybe 20 stations each, about 5 minutes at each station, doing a different task expected of a doctor. So it was watching their actual performance, and you had a range of different examiners matching it, marking it. So it was a much fairer and valid form of assessment. So that really has caught on.
Yeah, so this is the OSCE we're talking about, no?
OSCE,
so the
yes,
objective structured clinical examination.
Yeah, clinical exam,
Wow.
yeah.
So that's been
It's really
now... Yeah, that's now been kind of what people use for how long? When did people kind of
Well,
start
the first
implementing
paper we
this?
wrote was in 1975. In fact, we've got a meeting in Barcelona in August, and there's a new university there, and they're hosting a special celebration on 50 years in the OSCE, because it's now been used for over 50 years.
Congratulations. That's amazing.
So it's interesting.
So incredible.
I kind of have a question on that, because I can relate slightly in how languages are tested, because I've seen different types of languages being tested. And in France, for example, the most known exam for English language is also a multiple choice question. And I took that exam because I was in their education system. And all of my friends that were French, that didn't speak English as their first language, they all scored higher than me. So just because they were trained to answer that test.
Yeah, sure.
So I wonder, would you be able to say kind of the difference in what's tested, or what used to be tested with the multiple choice questions? Was it more simply theoretical knowledge that was tested, and that's now being able to see other characteristics that a doctor would need?
Precisely, that it really was, the emphasis was in theory rather than in practice, and that was reflected often the training program as well, and the lectures was emphasizing theory. And it's really fascinating that the police force at that time in the UK had a similar problem, and that the examination from superintendent to inspector was a written exam. And I remember they came to see me and said, "Look, we have a problem. This is not really, you can't tell how good a policeman is by his ability to answer a written exam." And I don't know how, but they'd heard about the OSCE, and they came and saw one and said, "Look, that's the sort of thing we need to test policemen for, or inspectors, it's the same thing. Can they carry out, take a history from a suspect or someone who they're talking to, or a victim? Can they collect evidence? Can they make decisions? Can they watch? Can they observe things and examine this car or whatever it is and make decisions? Can they problem solve? So the same performance things that a doctor has to do, priests have to do in a very different context. And they took on board that and became the objective structured performance related exam, the standard exam for the police force. And this actually featured, maybe it was before your time, there was a television series in the UK, Inspector Morse, which was built on Inspector Morse, a policeman. And in it, one of the episodes was he was being confronted with this objective structured performance-related exam. And so it featured in this episode on Inspector Morse. So that was really my real claim to fame, is that my exam was featured Inspector Morse. But
we'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
But practically, I mean, what it did give me a thrill in the sense that it seems to me if an idea is a good one, then it should be able to generalizable and apply in other disciplines. And this really convinced me that there really was something special about this approach to assessment. Well, you could take it and apply, and it's now been applied in other nurses and physiotherapists and dietitians have also applied in their areas as well. So the fact that you can take the principles behind it and apply it in other disciplines is, I think, is a very suggesting that there's a good idea there. So that's, I think, why it's persisted over 50 years' time.
Yeah, and not only over 50 years, but on a global level as well. So like you're saying, you're going to Barcelona because they've also been using it there and in the States.
I imagine the medical industry, like lots of very regulated industries, are very static. How quickly was that able to catch on, and how quickly did that spread? Because I feel like that must be a massive change.
Yeah. An interesting question. And I think one of the problems with any innovation in medical education is the conservatism of the medical profession. I think we're inherently conservative. And indeed, there was a report from Australia a few years ago on the future of medical education in Australia. And it came up with some very good recommendations. And I thought, looks very ambitious and very interesting. I'll be interested to see what happens. But the final page of the report said, look, we've got all these useful suggestions, but we suspect that because of the natural conservatism of the medical profession, many of these will never be put into practice. So you're absolutely right. While we adopted the D in 1975, it was many years later before it became widely known in the States. 20 years maybe later, before it carried on in the States. We had a chap with Ian Hart, who was a Canadian physician, came and spent a sabbatical year with me. And he was very impressed with this innovation. And he said, well, it's crazy that this is not being adopted more widely in the USA and Canada. What we should do is we should arrange a conference featuring this as a form of assessment. Let's have it, because he was based in Ottawa, and we can use it in my hometown. So we arranged a conference in Ottawa. We had about 500 people who came from all over the world, a lot from the States, to talk about clinical assessment, and spearheaded the OSCE. And the police actually came across and gave a paper there as well. Walter Epp, who was the Minister of Health in Canada, said, look, this is the sort of thing we must pay more attention to. It was so good that people said, let's have another next year. And so now it's happened really every second year. We've had an Ottawa conference, arranging the coming year, the 22nd Ottawa conference, where each year, every second year, people have come from all over the world and shared their ideas on assessment, of which includes OSCE, but other trends in assessment. So it really has caught on worldwide.
Amazing. Wow. And I think, obviously, when we're talking medicine, it's very important, like you say, what the quality of the doctors that are coming out are. Same as maybe with the police. It's jobs where people's lives are at risk, and the person deciding, what treatment or what course of action to take has a lot of weight. But I think in general in education, it's so theory based, and there are so few, even in degrees like mine, where it's media studies, that, before you even pick up a camera, you've got to do all this theory. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter the theory, if you can't use a camera, then what does it matter that you know the theory? So I think there's definitely a balance to be found, I think, most of different kind of higher education.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the problem is it's seen to be easier to accept a theory-based idea, a theory-based question, and to say who's passed and who's achieved and who hasn't, and set standards. But you are limited by what it is you're attesting.
I think something that's really interesting in lots of different ways of aspects of how things work in general in the world, to me it seems quite obvious that to construct that exam as the examiner, it's a lot easier to just put down questions that you know the answers to, get the student to choose the multiple choice, whereas constructing an exam where you have to evaluate the more personal side of things, the more practical side of things, it must be a lot more difficult to put together. And maybe that's something that stopped people from doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's exactly. And what that has illustrated in a changing trend in medical education as well, away from just looking at the process of education. How do we teach? How many lectures do you get? How many times in the lab, how many times seeing a patient, away from the process, much more to switch to the product. What's the outcome? And almost the reverse engineering, in a sense. You start with the outcome and then say, what do you need to do to deliver or assess that outcome? And therefore the move to what's been called outcome-based education is again been another bigger development where yes, the process of how you train people is important. But what do you expect? What are the learning outcomes? We came up with a model that kind of sets out these learning outcomes, and we called it the 3-circle model. In the centre circle were the outcomes related to the technical abilities. You know, what technically should the doctor be able to do in practice? Things like clinical examination, taking a history, examining a patient. What should he be able to do in terms of practical procedures? And then in the middle circle, that was doing the right thing. But the middle was doing the thing right. So how did he do each of these things? First of all, he did it with an understanding of why he was doing it. So it wasn't just a technician you were training to do these things remotely. You've got to have an understanding of why you're doing these things. But also, you're doing it with the right attitudes. Because again, one of the commonest complaints that patients have, and you may well agree, or I don't know from your own experience or not, that is the doctors sometimes have a good attitude, others they don't have a good attitude. And that middle circle is doing the thing right. And then in the outer circle is the right person doing it. It's not just a matter of the person you're training to be a doctor having all these technical skills and attitudes, but also they've got a lifetime career in medicine. And one of the areas that's attracted much more attention in recent years is this notion of future-proofing people, that in any training program, you need to train people not just for the present or for the immediate future, but for a long-term lifetime career. You know, I think we know that it's about almost everyone has a change of career during their lifetime. And are they able to work into that changed career? And medical practices are changing and what patients are expecting. Patient expectations are different. I mean, now, if we're going to say with the notion of AI and what patients expect now of a doctor with AI when they go in with having probably looked at AI themselves beforehand and what they're expecting is very different. So are doctors equipped to keep themselves up to date with these changes? Because what they know now, what I taught our students all these years ago about endocrinology, some of it still is relevant, but most of it is now changed. And this notion of what's called future-proofing the student for the future so that they can keep themselves up to date with the right knowledge, but also with the abilities to adaptability, are they resilient?
I mean, it makes total sense, everything you say. It seems obvious and it seems like it should be obvious from the beginning. And I think that just goes to show that things work in a certain way, and luckily you did this amazing work and luckily it caught on and you were able to spread that idea. How much of that was simply it was such a good idea that it did catch on fast, or did you have to put into work of getting the idea out, doing all these conferences? Was that a lot of your time? Did a lot of energy go into that, or did it just kind of come?
Well, no, I think there's some of these ideas that there's resistance to. I mean, if you look, even outside of medicine, if you look at this notion of outcome-based education, I mean, it seems a very logical subject.
I think we've already touched on it a couple of times, how you have really focused on student-centered education. This has really been the main focus of your work for so long, to make sure that students have a bigger role in their learning. So what is it exactly that inspired you to focus on that?
Well, I think it's a great question. Much of the attention in education has been much more teacher-centered. And in my SPICES model, at one end of the teacher-centered is one end of the spectrum, and the other more innovative end is student-centered. And where do schools sit on that spectrum? It seemed to me that you've different players in a curriculum. You've got the teacher, and you've got the patient, obviously, and you've got the student. And much more emphasis in the past has been on the teacher than on the student. And yet that's the key player in the process. Somebody was taking up some of these ideas and in London, and they said, look, I was a student, and they said, look, the problem is that in medicine, we believe that the teachers are there to teach and students are there to learn, but really it should be a partnership, that we can help with the teaching process. It should be a partnership in the teaching. And much of the planning, the curriculum, that's its focus. But there's one very key question was missing, and that was, how do you engage students in their learning? There's good evidence that from experimental studies that if students get engaged in their learning, they'll become better motivated and they'll learn better. The one way of measuring excellence was to what extent are students engaged in their learning. And if students are engaged in their learning, then it's a win for the teachers, for the curriculum, and for the student. And the evidence is that they'll then do better and the curriculum will be more effective. If you want to engage a student in their learning, or engage anyone in any activity, how do you engage someone in doing anything you want them to do? And it seems to me there are three things you've got to do. The first thing is you've got to interest them in what they're about to do. If they're not motivated to learn, then it's unlikely they'll go on learning. Why should they be doing this?
Yeah, give them that reason.
There's a quite interesting book, I don't know if you read, called The Why Question.
I think it's by Simon Sinek, who we have touched on.
You're absolutely right, Simon Sinek.
Yeah.
And he says the question is often forgotten about is the why question, and he shows it all sorts of, I don't know, you've looked at, your mum introduced me to it, but whether big companies or big successes are all ones who have asked the why question, what the context which you learn things really matter when you assess them.
You learn it for an exam rather than because you're actually interested.
Right. There's a very interesting, there was an interesting study, a kind of classic psychology study. It's been repeated a number of times, where they took a diver and they got the diver to learn a bit of text under the water. And then the diver to learn a bit of text, another bit of text, but very similar difficulty and same subject. But that second bit, they learned it out of water. And then they did a test of the diver. And the question I ask when I tell the story is, which do you think they remembered better? The bit they learned under the water, or the bit they learned out of the water? Which did they learn better? And this has been repeated in different contexts, and all come back with the same answer. And the problem is that something I didn't tell you. The question is, where were they tested? Because when they were tested out of the water, they remembered better what they learned out of the water.
Wow.
When they were tested under the water, they remembered better what they learned under the water. So the context where you learn things. So when you want the people to remember the anatomy, is actually in the context of seeing a patient. It's not an anatomy exam on the pathology laboratory. That's when it matters that you learn the anatomy, is in the context of seeing a living patient. When I was doing it at Dundee on day one of the medical school, gave the students hopefully a sort of motivated talk, but I showed them these outcomes of what they would be doing 5 years from now. This is what you should have achieved. You should have achieved these outcomes. A junior doctor who was just managing patients, I said, you tell us how these outcomes apply in managing this patient with a myocardial infarction, for example. So the students saw where they were going with these outcomes. But then I said to students, goals. But there's a journey ahead of you. You've got to commit to this journey. Spady, who actually described this the father figure of outcome-based education, said the number of features of outcome-based education. You've obviously got to specify what are the outcomes. And then you've got, secondly, he said, you've got to adjust the teaching and learning and assessment methods to these outcomes. But he said also there's a third thing that's important that people forget, is the teacher has got to be committed to make sure that students will pass. If you've selected the student for your school, if you admit to them, and this person in your program, You've got to ensure that they succeed. It's your responsibility. It's not that such thing as bad students, as bad teachers. As students, you've got to be committed to work towards that. And I said, look, students, if you're not committed to work towards these outcomes over the next 5 years, you should leave the class now. Don't come back in next week, because this is what your job is. And if you're not really committed to work with us, the teacher's going to work with you. It's going to be a partnership. You've got to be committed. It's your commitment to work to achieve these outcomes.
To call it a partnership, I think, is just such a beautiful way of looking at it.
Yeah. And then as you go through the points, I think it's so clear that this can apply to so many industries and not only education. Like as you go into the why question, it could be applied to businesses. It can be applied to everything.
It also kind of touches a bit on, in other episodes we've talked a little bit about flow, and I think these points help students reach that flow, which is when you're put in situations and you have to carry out a task, or in this case it would be learn something. And if you have the right level of challenge and capability, and you are given the right tools, and you're given the right feedback so that you know how you're doing, you're given clear goals to work towards, it just makes the whole process so much easier for the student.
You raise quite an interesting point there, again, that's attracted some attention that people have not thought about before, is the right level of difficulty. And questions, we tend not to think about this, but there's good evidence now that it is important that when setting students challenges as part of the program, you give them the right level of difficulty. If something's too simple for them to be tackling, then they just get bored. If it's too difficult, they won't get engaged.
I think it's super interesting and like a really nice way to do things. Like you mentioned, when you're presenting to a new promotion of students to say, this is where you're going to be at in 5 years. This is what you should be able to do in 5 years. I think when you start education, when you start a degree or a master's, you're hungry to know that. You're looking for, okay,
the result.
What can I become? Yeah. And I think in lots of cases, for myself, when I started my engineering career, people would ask me, okay, what are you going to be able to do when you are an engineer? And I wasn't able to answer the question because nobody had ever told me. They were like, this is the curriculum, and then at the end of this, you'll be an engineer. Okay, but what do engineers do? What am I going to be able to do? Nobody ever kind of put that up in front of me. So even though the students are hungry to say, okay, this is the person I'm going to be able to become, if it's not given to them, they can kind of lose that hunger and lose that motivation and that dedication.
It's interesting, engineering, because engineering, actually, one of the areas in outcome-based education initially was pushed by the engineers, and they called it education for capability, and that was the game derived in engineering, and it's now used in medicine as well. And what some of the big engineering firms were complaining that the honours graduates from universities they employed weren't actually able to do the jobs that they wanted when they put them in to help build the bridges or things. They didn't have things like communication skills or right attitudes and so on. They had a lot of the theoretical knowledge on building bridges, but they couldn't put it into practice. And they said that universities really should look again at their engineering courses. That's has actually happened now, so that not what I've been talking about medicine, but the same parallel has been happening in engineering. The engineering courses have become much more practically orientated.
And it's such a nicer way to learn. I kind of tested the two systems because my original university was very theory-based. These are the courses that you have to pass, and then from one day to the next, you can go and work. But it was such a frustrating, difficult way to learn, whereas I then did an exchange year in France, and it was a lot more practical, a lot more lab work. We did courses on management, on communication, things like this, and it was such a nicer way to learn because you did have that commitment. You did see the end goal. So, even students choose this way to study.
Yeah, we talked about the interesting the student, committing the student, facilitate the student so they can learn better within this framework to make training for doctors more efficient. The fourth point we've talked a little bit about already, but it would be future-proofing the student, no?
Sure. I think much of the discussion in the past would have stopped at that third level, but I think integral in this, engaging the student in their learning. What's our vision? What's the why are we engaging the student? And of course it is, as we've said, to interest the student, to commit the student, to facilitate their learning. But I think there is this, on top of all of that, the issue of future-proofing the student. We've got to engage the student that this is for a career of practicing medicine. This is not just what they need to learn or do over the next 5 years to get a qualification and then postgraduate training for 3 years, another 3 years specialist training. But they must be qualifying, practicing medicine maybe 30 years afterwards. I was at our graduation ceremony in Dundee just thinking these medical students were graduating. Many of them would be practicing medicine in 40 years' time. A worrying thought. What will medicine be like in 40 years of time? Very difficult to predict. And as a teacher, one will try to equip them for that. But it isn't a matter of giving them more and more information. That's not going to solve the problem, because information is changing. More than half of what they learn in medical school will no longer be true. So it's not that, it's equipping them with the ability to learn for themselves, this self-directed learning. You know, it was an interesting piece of work looking at what we don't do as medical teachers. It said, well, 3 things medical teachers don't do in relation to students, help them to learn. And one is, there are only 3 things you should be able to do is when you don't know something. And, you know, in medical careers, Peter, there are going to be things when you don't know the answer to something. When you don't know something, what's the question you should ask? Secondly, where do you go to get the answer to that question? And AI, of course, is that whole thing's opened up tremendously. Where do you go to answer that question? And thirdly, how do you evaluate the answer you get? Because it may not be right. And there was one example given of a GP, a patient came in to see him late on in his afternoon surgery, and she was on a new antibiotic, and she said, oh, this new antibiotic, what? I need to know more about it. Why is this? What are the side effects and whatever and so on? And the doctor had to admit that he had not, this is not one he'd used before and wasn't familiar with it. But he said, look, I'll find out and come up with the answers, and I'll come back and see you next. Come back and see me tomorrow afternoon, and we'll discuss the antibiotic. Then I'll try and find out for you some of the answers to these questions, which you're very reasonably answering. So the doctor went home that night, had his dinner quickly, and then started looking and found on the web something like 614 articles on this antibiotic. And how did he know which ones to read or how to interpret them or where to get the best answer? He said he'd never been taught this at medical school. You know, this was a new experience. But this was life. He had a need to know something. He didn't know what was the exact question he should have asked on the web. He didn't know where was there a guidance or routines or guidelines he could have better got the answers. And how did he evaluate these answers, which was one to rely on, so he could inform the patient the next day he met her. And even, I think, the notion of learning how to learn, we just assume that learning is natural. Again, some studies have shown that the way students learn, and doctors after they're qualified as well, learn is inefficient. That some of the most popular ways of learning, somebody reads a page and then pauses and then rereads the same page again to learn it better, or even underlines bits of it or highlights bits of the page they want to remember better. These are widely adopted as student behaviours because they think it's a perfect way of learning. In fact, both of these methods are less efficient than some of the other methods that are available now to learn. If you read the page and then you ask yourself some questions about it, that's infinitely better because you're switching things from your short-term memory to your long-term memory.
And making sure that you've understood as well what you're reading. It's not just about reading and memorizing. It's making sure that you understand what you're reading.
So that this whole issue of teaching how to learn is something that one should don't take it for granted, because students they will choose what they think is the quickest and for them what they seem as the most efficient way of learning. But it actually isn't, in fact isn't. And this, if they're going to spend their life having to go on learning, when there's no teacher there to check them out or to test them or help them, they've got to learn for themselves, got to be self-directed learners, and that matters later. This is part of future-proofing them for their life in medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. In my first year of university, I had a teacher say to us at the beginning of the lecture, in the technology world, in the audiovisual world, everything moves so fast. 1 year is like 7 years. So how am I supposed to teach you something now that is going to be still useful and still used, practiced in 4 years' time when you leave? You know, it's not, if you now sit and memorize this chapter that I've given you, is that going to still be of any use to you in 4 years' time? And he said, what we really need to do is make sure you have a base to, like you say, to make sure that you have that basis of knowledge that you can then grow on and keep learning from. Because it's not realistic in this day and age, in any, I think in anything, that things are going to stay the same.
It's absolutely true. And it's a real challenge. I saw an example of this, an extreme example. Recently, we were wanting for another publication I'm involved with, a chapter to be written on artificial intelligence and its role in education. It was going to be published in another book. Sadly, the timetable to publish books is rather longer than I would have hoped or expected. By the time you get all the manuscripts in and get the publishers get it printed, it's about a year and a half, the average time with some publishers. And it was the case with this particular book. And this chap, who was a former expert in this artificial intelligence, we asked him to do it. And to my surprise, he said no. I said, why? He said, well, because by the time I'll give you this article next week or whatever, but by the time it gets published, it'll be all out of date. So there's no point in me writing this article, publishing it in your book, because by the time it's published, it'll be out of date. So that made me realize this is one of the big problems is keeping up to date. That's an extreme example, but probably a very, very relevant one indeed.
Yeah.
It makes me think I have a lot of kind of people my age that are starting to work, they started their new jobs, etc. And they all say to me, oh, but I don't know how to do anything. I don't know how to do this job. How am I supposed to go through the interview and everything? And like, I think in most education, I always say to them, hey, you've learned to learn. You are this perfect little learning being
Machine.
And you're going, no matter the job, no matter how expert you are, you're going to learn the job once you start the job. So that's what you have to sell. You don't have to be an expert already, at least at our age. You just have to be capable to learn quickly and to listen and to have that base to be able to then learn on the job. I mean, you probably need a pretty big base when you're going into a medical job, but
Yes. Yeah, but then
you always need that little bit of flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to know, as you studied medicine in maybe, was it the 60s when you studied medicine? What would you say is the biggest difference now from when you studied medicine to what the curriculum is set up now in medicine degrees? What do you think is the biggest difference?
I think it is this move away from theory to practice.
Yep.
And in terms
That's
of
so
practice, moving away from just the technical aspects of practice to much of the attitudes and other, having things like empathy and respect and the ethics of medical education of practice. I think these are the differences that they make. And these are, I think, very major differences.
Yeah.
And more recently, I think
So
we'll see this, the big difference will be this, more recently, I think the most recent difference is this notion of acceptance of this future-proofing. I think that was a very relatively recent, that's one of the last 5 years or something people have really been thinking about this.
Yeah. It's not just thinking more about the student, it's thinking more about the patient, the person who's going to be receiving the care as well.
Yeah, sure.
And it's obviously come such a long way since you were in education yourself to the stage that it's at today. Are there things that you're excited about for the future, for the years to come, or do you think it's already at a pretty good stage?
Well, I think there's always room for improvement. I mean, I think these are the dynamic process. I think one of the futures of outcome-based education, it's not a static thing. It's dynamic. And I think if we look each year or each other year at the outcomes, you'd produce a slightly different list. You know, I think people's priorities and facts and trends change. What's expected in terms of the health system, what's about medical advances. The roles of doctors will change, no doubt at all. So I think we're going to see ongoing change.
And moving a little bit away from medicine, obviously your career has been so amazing, but it's still ongoing. And that is something that I know that both Saoirse and I have as such a inspiration for us, that you still find such passion in what you do. What is it, do you think, that keeps you so inspired and motivated every day to keep just learning?
I think it is enjoying what you're doing. I mean, I think if you don't enjoy what you're doing and committed to feeling this is worthwhile doing, and also helping others to do it as well, willing to share any passion with others.
So
I think enjoying what you're doing. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Yeah, go.
Enjoying what you're doing is super important in everything we do. Even if there's a topic that we like a lot to start with, if we lose that joy, if we lose that passion, or start putting too much pressure on ourselves, or start having a bad time of it, then we can pretty quickly lose inspiration.
Our next season is going to be focused on mental health within the workplace. And we were wondering if we could get a bit of insight as a little, like we said, this is the end of our first season. So as a bridge towards our second season, we were wondering if we could get some perspectives from a different generation on these topics that are now kind of buzzwords, and they're now kind of much more used. And it's definitely something that's happened in the last maybe decade. What do you think about expressions such as work-life balance? Is this something that you've ever stopped to think about?
I think these are all very, very pertinent questions. Sure.
Is it something that students have ever spoken about, things like burnout or anything like that?
Oh, I think it is very much on the agenda, is this issue of burnout, sure.
Yeah. It's not something that you've ever struggled with, though.
Not personally.
That just shows
so much passion for what you do.
Yeah, that just shows that it's not something that you have. As a last question, we wanted to ask you if you have any advice for young people who are trying to choose what to do with the rest of their life, with their career path, and if they're feeling maybe unmotivated on trying to figure out what it is they're going to be spending the rest of their life doing. Have you got any advice for anybody in that situation?
Two things which we really have addressed partly already. I think is to spend a little time away from the day-to-day activity and think about why. Trying to answer the why question. What are they wanting? What would they like to achieve with their life? And what are they actually doing at the moment that's towards that ambition? And what should they do differently?
The end goal?
So I think to ask their own personal why question. And then secondly, as I've said earlier, the important one is easy to say, but I think it is a key issue for their own happiness and their own work-life balance as well. How are they going to enjoy what they're doing? Because if they're not enjoying, if they're trying what they're doing as a chore and a bore, then I think they are going to have burnout and not succeed. So I think they've got to learn to enjoy what they're doing. If not, there's something seriously wrong with what they're doing, and they've answered the wrong why question.
What a brilliant end note. Thank you so much.
What a way to end the episode. Thank you so much for joining us
today. To end the season.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and all the very best.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure. And just to have a conversation with you about everything you've done and your career, it's something that we've never discussed. So
I think we've both learned a lot.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Nice to meet you again.
And that's it. The end of the very first season of We Will Manage. What a wild ride. What a wild 16 weeks.
Crazy. So being our own managers, we have decided to practice what we preach a little and take a whole fortnight off. So our next episode will be out on September 4th. So same day of the week, same time, Thursday at 5 p.m., jumping into a whole new topic.
Yes. Next season, we are so excited about it. We're talking all about balance, from burnout to boundaries as an employee and as a founder. We are prioritizing our mind.
Having said that, we won't be abandoning you over the summer season entirely. You can still find us on We Will Manage Mondays in the meantime. So we'll see you there and have a little hangout.
Yeah. Keep up to date with what's going on in our lives. So see you there. See you next Monday.
See you on Monday.